So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief update on what happens in Australia. Not that it really matters to the US hog industry, but the general supply-demand situation in Australia is no different from what it is in the USA. Domestic demand for pork is flat and declining, and the same as it is in the USA. And so you have to look at what are the strategies you can overcome this with, and I think they'll apply globally. So if we start with the first slide. This is just a rundown of the Australian situation. It's interesting. We have a population of 22 million, a lot of desert and not a lot of rain. We slaughter only 5 million pigs annually. Pork production 350 to 450,000 tonne annually. And we import about 140 to 150,000 tonne. And the USDA are predicting that to go to probably 200,000 tonne in 2011. So it's a real threat to our industry. Number of producers, no one really knows. We just know how many pigs are killed. Our cost of production is about $2.06 USA per kilogram carcass weight, 2010. It was interesting to hear Steve Meyer saying the break-even in the US in 2011 is likely to be 75 cents, which puts it about $1.75 Australian per kilogram, and it's probably the closest we've ever been in cost of production to the US. I don't think it matters in the export markets, but I think the US is losing its international competitiveness, but the consequences we're not sure of yet. Our prices have always been fairly good, $2.50 to $2.70 per kilogram, so it's been quite a profitable industry. Small but profitable, and per capita consumption is interesting. It's probably as high as it is in the US, so the industry size just reflects the size of our population. We have unlimited grain. We're going to have a massive harvest this year, but we have increasing risk of drought, so there's a lot of uncertainty about our grain supply, and feed costs can jump, as much as $100 to $200 a tonne on an annual basis. And we don't have any major diseases. So that's the Australian situation. If we look at the efficiency of production in Australia in 2009, 2010, again, it's about, if you look at the average, it is pretty average. We have a light carcass weight compared to the US and the rest of the pork producing world, 73 kilogram. And that reflects retail demand and our reliance on the fresh meat trade. A lot of the manufacturing trade is taken up by imports. So we have a light carcass weight sold per sow per year, which affects overhead costs. Feed costs vary, and will probably be as low as $300, maybe less this year in 2011. Very efficient herd food conversion of 3.85. Top 20% of 3.4, which is probably more efficient than the US herd. And if you look at it on an energy basis, which we're going to have to in the future, we're targeting about 45 megajoules of DE. So basically, quite an efficient industry and getting more efficient all the time. If you look at pork and grain prices since 2004 through to 2010, and the two red lines reflect the price of pork and the price of bacon pigs, so lighter and heavier pigs. And you'll see we have a seasonal trend with the peaks in summer, which is, of course, near Christmas here. And in America, it's the peak, of course, is in June, July, in the middle of the year. And it's the same for Europe, exactly the same trend. You can see the green line, which is grain prices, 2007, 2008, exceeded by a long way pork prices. And then that reversed 2008, 2009, and now it's tending to reverse again. And the consequences are shown on the next slide. This is just the major grain price comparison. So we don't use corn over here. We use wheat, we use barley and sorghum or milo. And you can see how they track one another and how high they got in 2007, 2008, 2008, which has also been covered by both Steve Meyer and Brett Stewart. The next slide just shows, I think, the consequences. This is the profitability of Australian producers from January 2007 through to September 2010. And you can see those high grain prices in 2007, 2008 resulted in losses, and this is in dollars per kilogram carcass weight. And I think a comment by Brett that's probably wrong is that pork prices are related to grain prices. They're actually related to supply, and supply itself is affected by grain prices at some point, because there's a big lag from when grain prices go up to when there's rationalisation of the industry to get pork prices back up again. But they're not directly related to grain prices. It's an indirect, it's a supply situation. And I think this is an important thing for all of us to think about, is that if you look at domestic demand for pork in most of the developed countries, it is very flat, and it is the problem why price is so sensitive to supply. A 2 or 3% change in domestic supply in the US can change you from a profit to a loss. And it's, really the longer term future is the export markets and the increasing demand for pork globally, but not domestically in the US, Australia or Europe. The next slide shows the profitability from 2006 to 2010. You see the industry, apart from 2008, has been quite profitable, and very profitable. In 2009, people were making as much as $70 to $80 profit per pig, and now they're complaining that it's maybe down to $20 a pig. And Steve predicting $8 a pig profit for 2011, the US, I think is fairly scary, and going to be very, I think, volatile, and very little room for mistakes. This just shows what the consequences were of those high grain prices and losses in 2008 on the pigs slaughtered in Australia, and this is what affects price more than anything else. It's a change in supply. You can see we've gone from slaughtering through to about September 2008, 5.4 million pigs a year, and that was providing a price of about $2.40, $2.45 a kilogram average. That declined with the very high grain prices and losses, and now we're up back to about 4.6 million pigs slaughtered annually. And this is the reason why pig price and profitability changed to the extent it did, and it's no different, I don't think, for the USA or Europe, where we're seeing a decline in pig numbers in response to losses, continuing losses, particularly in Europe. So this is just a consequence. It's a much bigger change than the US have seen in response to those losses for 2 years almost. But what it does tell you is price remains very sensitive to supply, and if you do not have an export outlet, I mean, the country and the industry remains very vulnerable, and Australia is vulnerable. You'll see our carcass weight over time. This is from September 2006 to September 2010. It's light, very light compared to the US. It gives you a major competitive disadvantage. But if you look at how much profit we make per sow per year, and, Brett didn't put up the Australian prices, but for the last year and a half, Australia's been receiving the highest pig prices in the world. So there's tremendous profit can be made per sow under these situations, simply because this is what the retail industry demands, and they're not willing to change. And imports are taking up a lot of our manufactured product. If you look at imports, you can see from 1993 to 2010, been a marked increase in imports. And this has pretty much taken out the manufacturing business from the Australian producer. It's actually grown domestic consumption of pork, and this imported material comes from, and I'll show you in a moment, it comes from the USA, it comes from Canada and Denmark, and it's used for the manufacture of hams and bacon. But a major threat and constraint to the Australian industry, but reflects the real world, and Brett made this point that the US industry sits probably best positioned to take advantage in terms of its cost competitiveness and also increasing demand for pork over the longer term to increase producer profits in the long term. This slide just shows where the imports come from. You can see from 2004 to 2005, the yellow section, which is the USA, has increased its share, and Brett made this point, and we'd be quite happy if you gave some of that up. It's followed then by Denmark and Canada, which has lost its share of our market quite considerably, down about 50% over time. The Americans grown, has doubled over the last 6 years. I've just quickly, that's the Australian industry. The demand for pork and the seasonal fluctuation in price is exactly the same as it is in Europe and the US. The highest demand in summer, and then it declines into Easter if you have less kill days and less demand for pork. It's quite an efficient industry. It's small and will not play a major role in the export markets of pork in the future. But it's providing a very good living for Australian producers, and its challenges are how to address imports, continue to get more efficient, and I'll cover those a bit later. I quickly just want to go through the USA industry, because this is the best example of a global industry. And we've already heard a bit about it, and I don't want to tell Americans how to suck eggs. What has been impressive, and the point's been made by, particularly by Brett, is just how productive the US pork industry is. I think it's losing its productivity and it's getting hurt more than, say, we are by increasing grain prices, because there's still an inherent inefficiency in the middle of the industry, and it's in the grower-finisher pig rather than the sow herd. But this just shows a decline in breeding herd from 1990 to 2008, but the marked increase in production. So it's just a general reflection of enhancing productivity, and there's no matter what performance indicator you look like, the US industry's done extremely well and is likely to continue to do extremely well. The consequences of this are shown on this slide, and this reflects pork or hog inventories against the number of operations. And like pork industries worldwide, the number of producers are declining markedly, but the amount of pork is increasing at the same time. And I think in the US, your top 20 producers probably cover, 50, 60% of the production. In Australia, 14% of our top producers are producing 70% of the pork. And that's the way things are going and why we see such big changes in efficiency. But it looks to me as though we're going to continue to see a consolidation of the US and global pork industries for a period, and that's one of the main reasons that we're seeing an increase in global pork prices. The pig price is always a challenge, and Stuart, Brett made the point before, but this just shows pig prices in the US between 1990 and 2008. And there's only one time in that period, and that was in 97, where the price has been, the actual price has been higher than it was 20 years ago. And this is the challenge we always face, is that there is a flat demand when you look at it domestically, and the continued improvements we have in productivity are given away eventually by increased supply. And so the margins always come back, and price really does need to change. And all the indications are that real prices could change as global demand for meat increases and grain prices increase. The next slide just shows profitability in the US industry over that time. Again, no different from Australia, no different from Europe. There are no guarantees. You can be the most efficient producer of pork in the world, and it'll really depend on how that profitability affects supply and how that bumps against the demand curve, whether there's going to be any money in it. And if you look at the industry over 20 years, it's generally profitable. There's not a lot of money being involved in it, and it remains vulnerable to grain price shifts. And that, I think, is where we're looking at, the biggest threats going forward, and everyone's made that point. So there are no guarantees. 2010, 2011 look like they'll be good profitable years for the US industry, but going beyond that, there are no guarantees. And I don't think anyone can predict profitability beyond 2011, and it sounds like it's going to be marginal and vulnerable. If you look at domestic growth, and this is what Brett made a point about, this is for the US showing beef, pork, chicken and fish. Chicken is the only one that's increased over this period. If you look at it for pork, very, very flat. And if you look at the prices, the real price of pork, over the last 20 years, it's declined at a very rapid rate and is well south of zero at the moment. Just emphasize the point that's been made previously that it's changes that are going to happen globally and enhancing the competitive position of the US. That was where the US, I think, future lies as for its producers. This is the good news on this slide. It's exactly what Brett made the point, is the US has been phenomenal at developing export markets. You can see from 1980 where they were net importers, you were net importers. 94, 95 become net exporters, and exports, as we've heard, have reached 20% of production. And it's really where the US industry's future lies, is in exports and taking advantage of increasing wealth around the world, particularly in the Asian countries, and developing and keeping those markets. If you look at the global business indicators, and again it reiterates what we've heard, and I've only shown here, this is for 2007, it's because it's the only time I've had a data set where all those countries were compared. But without dwelling on it, if you look at the actual feed costs of the US, at this point they're quite high, that was 2007, but even now they're getting high again, they're 220, which I've never heard of before per tonne, metric tonne. But you can see they're still lower than any other country. The herd feed efficiency, which is a reflection of how efficiently feed and energy is used by the industry, is relatively good, not compared to, say, Canada, and that's an area where the US industry definitely needs improvement if it's to take full advantage of the opportunities offered. And if those Canadian values are true for HFC on an energy basis, I mean, that is an amazing achievement, but as we've heard from their production and profitability, it doesn't guarantee success. But all this tells you is that the US is the most competitive pork producing country in the world. I think that superiority is under challenge, and there are areas that where improvements are needed. I think the secret to success, this is for Australia, we're looking longer term. We've got to continue to enhance the efficiency of production and address grain volatility. Grain supply and prices going forward is going to be, I think, volatile and the single biggest issue, affecting the profitability and growth or contraction of pork industries. another big issue in Australia, and it's been legislated so it's affecting governments, it's affecting community, consumers, is the welfare issue. And we need to, and you've probably heard the news that Australia producers decided to phase out gestation stalls voluntarily by 2017. And I think by taking a lead in the welfare issue, there's a real chance that we can reduce imports because we have the community and governments on side and now the retailers. And it's an issue I think the US needs to be aware of. It's become big overnight here and affecting where we're going to go in the future. We need to improve the quality of our product and tap into higher-end Asian markets. There's no way we can compete in the commodity markets, even though they're going to grow like the US can. We need to better understand our feed costs when they go way beyond the cost of grain in Australia. And even though Steve Meyer made the point that future contracts are going to be risky and more costly, cost-supply contracts for producers, and integrated producers particularly, probably one way of minimising risk going forward. If you look at the forecast for 2011, we have a massive harvest. But it's been delayed by weather. It's actually raining over here at the moment. It won't stop. Whereas the last 5 years it hadn't rained. So feed costs, we're going to have a lot of weather damaged grain. Feed costs will average about $320, but maybe even lower, maybe as low as $300 a tonne and vary across the states. Price is less predictable, but I think it could return towards longer-term averages, maybe $250, $260 a kilogram. So there's the cost of production, $226. So it's going to be a margin of 18 to 24 cents a kilogram, $13 to $17.50 a pig. But like Steve said, very little room for error. But at least positive, but tough. If you look at it globally, again, everyone's going to have to enhance the efficiency with feed is used. I think exploit growing global demand for pork and cost advantages, and this is where the US is really well positioned. But you have to understand global customer demands. You've got to ensure, I think, that export markets are maintained. They are, they can be risky, and we see the Russian situation. And, so eventually, when you lose them, they come back, the meat comes back domestically and really depresses price. You need to be aware of the growing welfare and environmental concerns. They're likely to affect all countries eventually, and those who take care of them first will have some market advantages. And again, this cost-supply contracts, Steve has dealt with them very well. The final slide, if you look at what's going to happen in 2011 globally, I think Europe's likely to remain under pressure on prices, even though the global pork price, if you look at it globally in the late November reports, it's actually on the rise. But grain feed costs are really going to have a continued adverse effect in Europe, and I think you'll see further contraction of the industries over there. I think US is definitely looking at reasonable tighter margins, and Steve has covered that. Price will be affected by your exports, domestic supply, but futures are positive. I think there's going to be slight further global consolidation of pork industries in 2011. Many unknowns remain, with grain prices likely to remain volatile, domestic demand in Europe, North America, globally remaining flat. So the big potentials in exports, and no one's beaten the US in that. And I'll just finish up on this slide and want to just look at the one purple section here, because technology is not the saviour of our industries. There's a lot of policy matters going on. And our issue at the moment, and one that has great potential and threat, is the social and welfare issues associated with pork production. Eventually it's going to be the environmental issues. So they're real here, they've been legislated for or forced on producers, and there's been a tendency here to take the higher ground and go voluntarily, but these are the issues that we're going to face. So Ned, I'll finish up there. I think we've all said it. The US industry is very well positioned for the future, but still faces, I think, a lot of challenges, and probably has declined in its competitive position and is coveted by increasing exports. So I thank you all for your time and for the invite.